My GF's mom caught me staring at her. She smiled, "Come with me." The moment she caught me staring at her, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. I froze beside the kitchen doorway, my face burning with embarrassment, while my girlfriend's mother slowly turned toward me. For a second, neither of us moved. Then, instead of getting angry, she gave me a strange, gentle smile and quietly said, "Come with me." I had no idea that following her down that hallway would change the way I understood family, love, and the silent pain people carry behind closed doors. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness can give people a second chance, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear a story about compassion, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. You never know whose heart might need a little hope today. My name is Daniel, and at 24, I was convinced I understood what love meant. I had been dating Emily for almost 2 years. She was kind, funny, and stubborn in the most beautiful way. But her family was completely different from mine. Emily's mother, Margaret, was a quiet woman who rarely spoke about herself. She always seemed calm, but there was something in her eyes that made me feel as though she had lived through more pain than she ever admitted. The first time I visited their house, Margaret welcomed me warmly. She remembered how I took my coffee, asked about my work, and always made sure I had enough food. But she never talked about her past. Whenever Emily mentioned her father, the room seemed to become slightly colder. I knew her parents had separated years ago, but Emily never explained much. One Saturday evening, Emily asked me to stay for dinner. Afterward, she went upstairs to take a phone call, leaving me alone in the living room. Margaret was standing near an old bookshelf, looking at a framed photograph. Without realizing it, I stared at her. Not because I found her attractive, but because her expression suddenly changed. For one brief moment, she looked completely broken. She noticed me. That was when she smiled and said, "Come with me." I followed her upstairs, confused and nervous. She stopped outside a small room and opened the door. Inside were boxes stacked against the wall, old photographs, letters, and several pieces of furniture covered with white sheets. She walked to a wooden box and opened it. Inside was a collection of photographs of Emily as a little girl. Margaret picked one up. Emily was perhaps 6 years old, standing beside a man I recognized immediately from an old picture on the living room shelf. "That was her father," Margaret whispered. Then she showed me another photograph. Emily was older, maybe 16, sitting beside her mother in a hospital room. Margaret finally told me the truth. Emily's father had not simply left the family. He had abandoned them after years of broken promises and financial problems. He had taken money from Margaret, disappeared for months, returned drunk, and repeatedly promised he would change. Eventually, he left for good. Margaret had raised Emily alone. But that wasn't the reason she had brought me upstairs. She reached into the box and pulled out a small envelope. "This is something Emily doesn't know," she said. Inside was a letter written by Emily's father shortly before he disappeared permanently. It contained an apology, but no excuse. He admitted that Margaret and Emily deserved better and that he had been too weak to become the man they needed. Margaret had kept the letter for years but never shown Emily. Then she looked at me and said something I would never forget. "She is afraid of being abandoned again." Suddenly, everything made sense. Emily's occasional fear when I worked late. The way she sometimes asked whether I was happy with her. The way she became quiet whenever we argued. I had always thought she was simply insecure. She wasn't insecure. She was protecting an old wound. Margaret wasn't warning me to leave her daughter. She was asking me to understand her. I told Margaret that I loved Emily and that I couldn't promise our future would always be perfect. But I could promise that I would never punish Emily for wounds she didn't create. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She smiled and said, "Then you understand more than I expected." A few weeks later, Emily and I had our first serious argument. I was offered a job in another city, and I wanted to take it. Emily thought I was planning a future without her. Instead of getting angry, I remembered Margaret's words. I sat beside Emily and listened. For the first time, she told me everything. She told me how terrified she was that one morning she would wake up and discover that I had simply decided she was too much trouble. She told me she had watched her mother wait for someone who never came back, and she couldn't bear becoming that woman. I took her hand and told her something simple. Love wasn't about promising that nothing would ever hurt. Love was about refusing to disappear when things became difficult. We decided to move together. Years passed. Emily and I eventually married in a small ceremony. Margaret sat in the front row, crying before the ceremony even began. When I looked at her, she smiled through her tears. After the wedding, she gave me the same wooden box I had seen years earlier. Inside was the photograph of Emily as a little girl. On the back, Margaret had written one sentence, "Thank you for staying." I realized then why she had smiled that night. She hadn't caught me doing something wrong. She had caught me looking at the sadness behind her eyes. And somehow, she trusted me enough to show me the part of her life that almost nobody had ever seen. Years later, when Margaret became ill, Emily struggled terribly. She was terrified of losing the only parent who had never left her. I spent months helping them both, driving Margaret to appointments, cooking meals, and sitting beside her when she couldn't sleep. One evening, Margaret quietly took my hand. "You kept your promise," she whispered. I couldn't answer. I simply held her hand. She passed away several months later. At her funeral, Emily cried against my shoulder, and for the first time I understood that some people don't need grand gestures. They need someone who stays. That night, Emily found the old photograph in the box. On the back, she saw her mother's handwriting. She read the words aloud through her tears. "Thank you for staying." Emily looked at me and whispered, "She knew." I nodded. Because Margaret had known long before either of us understood what our love would become. She had seen something in me that I hadn't yet seen in myself, the ability to stay when leaving would have been easier. And perhaps that is what real love is. Not perfect words. Not endless happiness. Not a life without pain. Sometimes love is simply choosing not to walk away when someone is afraid. If this story touched your heart, please support the video with a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to the channel. Your small gesture may help this story reach someone who needs its message today. And before you leave, comment, "I choose to stay," if you believe that true love means standing beside someone even when life becomes difficult. Because sometimes, the person who needs saving isn't asking for help. They're only waiting to see if you'll stay.